Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special stream where I'm gonna go over my theories about the Zelda timeline. So this is a little bit different than anything that I've done before. Like, we've played Zelda here a couple of times, and I usually switch back and forth between doing art, doing some games. But The Legend of Zelda is something that is, I'd say, is really important to me. Like, I really enjoy it. And theorizing about the timeline's been something that I've been doing since probably the Wind Waker, right? Because I feel like the Wind Waker was that point where we started to notice that there was a timeline, or that there could be one, right? I think it was the first time where it was directly obvious that they were relating the events of the game to a game that had happened before, right? So, since then, they had released the Hyrule Historia, which had an officially laid out timeline, which laid it all out, and did irreparable damage with the inclusion of the hero is defeated timeline, right? So we know that was a thing that they published, and okay, sure. So I think what I want to do is I want to preface everything that we're going to do here. We're going to go over the Hyrule Historia timeline. Then we're going to go over, I believe it's the Encyclopedia timeline, which just has a small amendment and a clause, which we're then going to use because we can. And nobody can stop me, so I'm just going to say whatever I want. And yeah, so let me pull this up, because I set up some stuff here. Going to pull up the Historia page. Here it is. Wow, it's behind everything. Let's move that Historia to the top. Historia. So, let's take a look here. We can see that it starts off with Skyward Sword. So they initially published this in the Hyrule Historia, which came out after Skyward Sword did, and Skyward Sword, did a lot in terms of claiming its place on the timeline. It set forth with the idea that it was going to be the first story that is the origin story of everything. So I think it's best to keep it that way, and we'll start there. So it goes Skyward Sword, and then it leads into the Minish Cap, which was originally, before Skyward Sword, said to be the earliest story in the timeline. So we have the Minish Cap, then that leads directly into Four Swords, because it's sort of related. The Four Swords games are, like, we include them because they are games, and for some reason, we treat them as canon, because why wouldn't we? It's a Zelda game, and more on that later. So we have Ocarina of Time, right? So Ocarina of Time was long theorized before this official timeline to create a timeline split, because we could not reconcile the backstory of Wind Waker with Majora's Mask or Twilight Princess, right? It just did not work. Like, Wind Waker came out, and it was very clear, like, what they had happened. And then Twilight Princess came out, and it was just, like, completely different, and that sort of sparked the idea that there must be an alternative timeline. What we didn't expect was there to be three, right? I don't think anybody was sitting there going, man, I bet you there's 3 timelines, one of which the hero gets killed by Ganondorf, so all this bad stuff happens. Like, that was on nobody's radar at the time. So, okay, we'll go down the child timeline first. So it goes from Ocarina of Time, which then splits into 3, but we'll go down child. So it goes Majora's Mask, then Twilight Princess, then Four Swords Adventures. And then, alternatively, in the adult timeline, we have The Wind Waker, and then its direct sequel, Phantom Hourglass, and then Spirit Tracks. So you'll notice, like, even here, the majority of the games don't take place in either of these timelines. They take place in the one where the hero is defeated. And that's really weird. Why are most of the games in a timeline, which is like an what-if alternate universe? So in that one, it starts off with A Link to the Past, goes Oracle of Seasons, or it says Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, and then it leads to Link's Awakening, eventually to the original Legend of Zelda, and then to the Adventure of Link. So that's where the first timeline sort of ends. There were no other games at the time, so I wonder if I could swap this out for the window. Let me check it out. Window capture. Where is... Oh, I don't know what it did. I'm not gonna mess with it because it's weird. Oh, yes, here we go. Now I got some control over this window. And then I'm going to bring up the amended one. Okay, so the amendment was published in the Hyrule Encyclopedia, I believe. And it's mostly the same. And they didn't change all that much, other than kind of showing that it's more like 2 timeline splits here, which then splits into 2 more. It's just kind of like a little bit strangely laid out. Actually, it kind of does that in the original one too, a little bit. But here, the main thing that they changed is the positioning of Link's Awakening. And then they also added in Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes because they were new. So here it shows that Link's Awakening takes place before Oracle of Seasons and Ages, which have now also swapped positions. So in the original one, it says Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. In this one, it says Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Doesn't really matter. They don't have that big of an impact, depending on which order you play them in. So they are kind of side by side, even though that they are sequential. So then, yeah, they put A Link Between Worlds after Oracle of Ages, and Triforce Heroes is a direct sequel to that. Which still also just leads to The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link. They did not put Breath of the Wild on this timeline, even though I think it was out. It might not have been out yet. But they also included one little tiny asterisk here. And I'm gonna pop it up. Because it is right here. Alright. So at the bottom of the page, it reads, "Attentive readers may note that the timeline shown here differs slightly from the one found in Hyrule Historia." And then it says, "The timeline can be interpreted in a number of ways and may change depending on new discoveries that have come to light and on the player's imaginations." So they've given me an asterisk to do whatever I want with the timeline. It's whatever I think it is, which was probably their intention all along, because as anybody who's been theorizing about The Legend of Zelda for any amount of time, really, you really start to understand that for the most part, they don't really care about the timeline. They just kind of go, okay, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And then they fit it in wherever, and they just make fun games that usually have some sort of centralized gimmick. Like, that is how Nintendo goes about making games. So, but the big question has been, where is Breath of the Wild on the timeline? And then where is Tears of the Kingdom on the timeline? So, Tears of the Kingdom has given us a lot of clues, because Breath of the Wild gave us so many clues that we could not possibly decide where it goes. It seemed to fit anywhere you wanted it to. Also, it gave itself so much time in the future that anything could happen. And that's still true. But Tears of the Kingdom makes one thing clear, right? And it basically says it's completely different, right? So, if you are not aware, this is where I'm going to start to get into big time spoilers for Tears of the Kingdom. Okay? You've been warned. Okay. So, it's all about Ganondorf. If you follow Ganondorf throughout the entirety of the timeline, you can very easily figure out where any particular game is supposed to sit. That being said, the Ganondorf that we see in Tears of the Kingdom, he's just Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time, right? Like, he's doing the exact same stuff that Ocarina of Time Ganondorf did. But it's all different. So what does that say? What does that mean? Well, it means that we're seeing an alternate timeline where things are happening differently, right? So if timeline splits are a thing in The Legend of Zelda, which they are, definitely, then that means that other time splits can also be a thing. So I would say that there's one particular spot that can have a major timeline split, which can lead to all kinds of things. So, it's Skyward Sword. The end of Skyward Sword has some time travel shenanigans, which we'll get into. But I propose that time split, the alternate timeline that's created that we have not been following up until now, leads to the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. That's number one. Okay, so that's it. I have 3 goals going into this timeline revision, and that's number 1, is that Skyward Sword creates a timeline, a split timeline. Number 2, and this is like a thing that maybe I should point out on the Hyrule Historia. So I'm just gonna select it and bring it up so that we can take a closer look. Amended to, you can just go away. We don't need this, we just need Hyrule Historia. Okay, I'm gonna make it bigger. Okay. Right down here, we have this. Before The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link, they claim on this timeline that an event called the Tragedy of Princess Zelda the First happened. Right here. And it's my goal to remedy this as well, because that's something that doesn't make any sense, and they even kind of brush it off in the further pages in the Hyrule Historia. They're just like, you might notice that she's not the first Zelda, but so we're not gonna. That's no good. It doesn't work, and it doesn't make sense. but it will make sense. And then the third, there was a third thing. Where was it? I was thinking about the third thing, but maybe I never actually thought of one. Oh well. So, we have the two things that I'm trying to put together. Maybe I'll remember the third thing later. Let's just put this away for now. To the side, where we can reference it later. Because I think, while the Hyrule Historia is now outdated, I think it is still really useful for understanding a lot of the various things that have happened. Oh, I think it's possible that the third thing is the Imprisoning War. That we're gonna make the Imprisoning War work. Like, obviously, they directly name drop the Imprisoning War in Tears of the Kingdom, and it's a thing that's right on the timeline listed as the Imprisoning War. Like, it's right there, and I don't think there's any reason to think that that is not the Imprisoning War. Like, they name it, and it's right here on the timeline. They directly called it that because it's something that we know about, and there's no reason for them to just like, right? Like, just call it something different. If it's a completely unrelated thing, then call it something different. But they didn't. They used the terminology from the timeline. So those are the three things that are gonna happen, is that Skyward Sword split, fixing the tragedy of Princess Zelda I, and the Imprisoning War, and subsequently I think that like the entire hero is defeated line gets just, we're just gonna remove it. The game died. Okay, so let's pull up. I've been working on this, and it's my breakdown of the timeline. So I'm gonna pop it up. Window capture? Yes. Oh, I'm getting a blood moon. Spooky. Why is it not moving? Ah, here we go. Okay. Gonna push this to the side and bring this in here so that we can still look at it. What did I just move and change? I have no idea. I need to lock things properly so that things don't just start moving around at random. Okay. So we'll keep that. Thanks, Blood Moon. Okay. So, as we can see here, I've put a timeline split onto the Skyward Sword. So this Skyward Sword leads into two different areas, one of which leads into all the games that we're familiar with from the child and adult timelines, while this other timeline splits off and leads to all the Hero is Defeated timeline games, and then to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Whoop. If I zoom in on this, does that work? Oh yes, it works. Okay, cool. So I can lead us around that way, and it totally skipped a bunch of pages, but that's cool. That's fine. Okay. So it will take us to the beginning here, and we can start from the top. So, at the very beginning, as described in Ocarina of Time, we have the creation of the world, right? So the creation of the world starts with Din, Neru, and Faror doing their thing, and when they leave behind the Triforce. So, zooming in is a pain. Okay. That doesn't work. Because I can't pull it in any particular direction. Okay, I'm just not going to zoom in. Okay, so now we have, I think, a time period before Hylia's backstory in Skyward Sword. And I think that that's got to be the time frame of the original Zonai, right? So we learn in Tears of the Kingdom that the Zonai are like an ancient race that exists, and apparently the first king is Zonai, but he's kind of like the last of his kind, him and his sister. So that's like the end of their sort of lineage and time in the spotlight, right? So there had to have been a time where they were the major civilization, and I think that that's before Hylia's time and before the, inclusion of Demise, all those things. So they, become advanced, and then they ascend to the heavens. And then sometime after that, you have Demise and the demon tribes emerging from the depths. So it actually says this in Skyward Sword's backstory, specifically, that they came from the depths of Hyrule. Which is interesting, because we get to explore the depths in Tears of the Kingdom. So, yeah, as a Demise and the demon tribes come up to the surface, Hylia, one of the goddesses that I guess isn't one of the three that created the world, but is a some kind of lesser goddess, right? She wants to save her chosen people, like the Hylians. Like, I guess they're her race of mortals or something. It's weird, but she protects them specifically by raising islands into the sky and hiding them there. And then she goes back down to the surface to join with the other surface tribes. So your Gorons, they're like proto-Zoras at that time. It's weird that the Zoras see so much evolution considering how long-lived they are. But there's also some ancient robots. You can actually see them in the little picture here in the corner. But I theorize that those robots that we see in Skyward Sword are just like early Zonai tech from before they left, right? Because we know that they're very technologically advanced and they like to make all these robots. And then there just happens to be a whole bunch of like mines and stuff where they had stuff, and these robots mining out these time crystals, and time seems to be something that they were particularly interested in, meddling with their secret stones. So they have all those various races down there. Hylia bands together with them, and they manage to seal Demise. And that leads into... Wow, I just noticed that my logo here is got moved up over top of that thing. Great. So Hylia reincarnates as a mortal because she realizes that Din, Neru, and Faror set the Triforce in a way that gods can't use its power, right? It's made so that mortals can change their destinies with the divine power of the Triforce. But they have their own agency and that gods can't meddle in it. So Hylia decides that she should just be immortal so that she can. Right? So she's like, the loophole. I'm going to take it. And she reincarnates as Zelda. Not Princess Zelda the first, but the first Zelda, which is the one from Skyward Sword. And also puts in motion her plan for creating the Master Sword and training the hero. And that all happens because Demise is sealed and he's coming back, right? He's gonna come back. They know he's gonna come back. He's gonna break his seal. And as soon as the seal starts to break is when Zelda awakens to her power, Link goes on his adventure, creates the Master Sword, and then through the game, they make the Master Sword, and then Link does a series of trials, which are kind of weird, right? It takes him to areas that he's been before, but it's up in the Sky Keep. And so it's thought that those are kind of like him venturing into the sacred realm and getting this spiritual experience to obtain the Triforce, right? So he obtains the Triforce, and they use it to dispel the cloud barrier and crash Skyloft, the island that they're all living on, into the imprisoned, right? They crush the imprisoned, which is Demise's sealed form, and that's supposed to be the end of him, that's how the Triforce decides, we're gonna kill him by doing that. But then, seeing that he had no other option, Girahim, Demise's disciple or whatever, he grabs Zelda, and then they go through the Gate of Time to the Hyrule Historia says 1,000 years in the past, or actually I think it says thousands, plural. So whatever, it's some long time in the past. They go back in time to a point where Demise can still be resurrected. He does his little ritual, Demise comes back, and then Link goes through the Gate of Time, defeats Demise, seals him away in the Master Sword, and then they place the Master Sword in the pedestal, and then they go through the Gate of Time back to their own time. Okay, so all that sort of happens. In the past, there's a young Impa, and then in their present, there's an old lady who is also Impa. So I'm not quite sure how it's thousands of years, but maybe that was their mistake. Even if it was less than 100 years, it still all works. So you have Zelda giving her one of her bracelets. And then it shows they go to the present, and the old Impa's hair moves out of the way, and she has the bracelet, and then she disappears. And that's weird, right? She didn't die. That's, people die and they don't turn into light, they die. So she disappeared because of time travel stuff, maybe? Probably? Or she was a projection the whole time. It's a little unclear. I'm gonna say that she disappeared because of time travel stuff. Because when they came back, they inadvertently created a different timeline. So she can't exist anymore, therefore she disappears. Because what happens is, you end up in a situation where, in their present, Skyloft has fallen, and it's still fallen when they come back, and they're going to go and protect the Triforce, which is in their hands. They have it. And they're going to found the Kingdom of Hyrule, presumably. All right, that's what the Hyrule Historia says. And then you have the other timeline, right? So where they left the Master Sword is in a time where Demise doesn't exist. He's not sealed in the other thing. He's trapped in the Master Sword. And Skyloft is still up in the sky. And it has no reason to come down. So I think that's where we will go to the next set. So, the other side of the timeline, right, it proceeds pretty much exactly the same. You know, they eventually return the Triforce to the Sacred Realm. Apparently the Twilight are banished at that time. That's what one of the timelines said. So, pretty early on, I guess the Twilight were a thing, and then they were like, nope, get out of here. And then they establish the Kingdom of Hyrule. You get the Minish Cap. They make the Pickery Sword into the Four Sword. And they defeat Vatty. Then they defeat Vatty again. Right? The Four Swords is pretty inconsequential. And that eventually leads to Ocarina of Time. On the other side, we have to do a little bit of thinking about like what would happen in that timeline where Demise doesn't exist, and Skyloft has no reason to come down. Link and Zelda have no reason to awaken to their powers, so they just would live out peaceful lives on Skyloft. So, what happens? Well, I mean, given what we've seen between that particular Link and Zelda, they were, you know, kind of romantically involved, probably. So, good chance that, you know, they just have a family or whatever. At a certain point, though, I have to imagine that they would just get curious and go down anyways, right? Like, they would, because there were ways to get through the cloud barrier. They would eventually figure out and go down there and start settling the surface. Because the surface is safe, right? Because there's no Demise. The monsters are probably manageable. So they go down there and they start to settle the place. And then you are going to have this thing where... So the Zonai left. They just, like, went up into the sky. And took all their stuff with them, right? Except for all the stuff that they left in the depths, because apparently they were down there mining their Zonite stuff. That was probably during their prosperous time. And probably how Demise and the demon tribes got out in the first place was from them breaking it open. So, the Zonai, I guess, are curious and come down, and they find all these empty sky islands that weren't there before, and they go, huh, that's neat, and they move in, right? A little closer to the ground for whatever reason. You know, their civilization is probably on the decline or whatever, and they need less space. They move into the Skylands. And then after a certain point, they decide to also go down to the surface. And it's at that point you get that interaction between the Hylians and the Zonai, where the Hylians have been on the surface for so long that they don't even remember being on Sky Islands, right? Like that's old history, hundreds of years or something like that. And then the Zonai come down from the sky, and the Hylians are just like, wow, these guys are gods. Like, look at them and their divineness. And, of course, after a certain amount of time, we end up with... Yeah, I wrote here that they're start to disappear, right? Because we know that Rauru and Minoru are pretty much the last of their kind. There's one other Zonai, which we'll touch on, which is spoilers. But so after a certain point, they start to just like mix into the Hylian population, and then we have the Kingdom of Hyrule being established by King Rauru, the first king, and Hylian Queen Sonia. And so let's quickly go back to the other side of the timeline, because there's a little thing that I've added in here. I guess the other one of my goals, maybe there was 4 goals. I've got a lot of goals. But I want to try to fit all of the games that Nintendo has published. If Nintendo has published a Legend of Zelda game or spin-off, I think that they should be on here in some way. And they might help us solve some problems. This isn't one of them. Cadence of Hyrule is just a fun, cute game that's a spin-off of Crypt of the Necrodancer. And it is very hard to place on the timeline because it looks like A Link to the Past, and it plays like Crypt of the Necrodancer, and it has a lot of elements from all over the place. But there's one key thing, which I think puts it in a spin-off timeline of just before Ocarina of Time. Maybe like 40 years, 30 years before Ocarina of Time. All right, this very much greatly depends on how old you think Ganondorf is in Ocarina of Time, in the beginning portion of it. Like, looking at him, he's probably like 30 or something, maybe older. All right, I mean, there's a picture of him there. He's not old, but he's not young. He's yeah, he's a dude. And so if we look at him, you get to meet a young Ganondorf in Cadence of Hyrule. But then, you know, Octavo does some crazy stuff with time travel or whatever, and then steals Ganon's power from the future and then becomes a bad guy. And like it's all completely spun off from that. So just fun aside, I think it comes before Ocarina of Time in a spin-off timeline. So then you have the Hyrulean Civil War, which results in a baby Link being left with the Deku Tree. And then everything plays out Ocarina of Time. You know, Link gets the Master Sword, gets trapped in the Sacred Realm for 7 years, comes out the other side, goes on this adventure. They fight Ganondorf and his Ganon form. And then Zelda sends him back to his child timeline to live out his days. Interesting note here, she sends him back with the Master Sword. All other times he's had to use the Master Sword to go to and fro from the past into the future. But she sends him back to the past with the Master Sword, like, intact. And as Wind Waker describes it, the hero just vanished. That also means that the Master Sword vanished. So there is no Master Sword in the Wind Waker timeline. More on that later, because of course you will say, well, of course there's a Master Sword in that game, and more on that. So let's jump back to our new timeline here with the Kingdom Hyrule being established by King Rauru and Queen Sonia. So at some point, because we know that Zelda shows up or whatever, and then they start saying like, oh, you're like our blood descendant, and then spoilers, they both die. So clearly they have heirs to the kingdom. We just don't see them. They aren't important to the story, so but they must exist. But it's shortly therein, you know, the kingdom's been established long enough for them to have a castle. And then Zelda, the Sage of Time, appears. She arrives from the distant future And then Ganondorf shows up, and he's doing all the same things that he did in Ocarina of Time, right? So he tries to do his little insurrection thing, which I believe is the same as the Hylian Civil War, because that's the difference between there's Hylians and there's the Gerudo, and they're both kind of Hylians, but there's like a split there. So the Civil War is Hyrule is supposed to be all of it, and Gerudo is going, oh, I don't want to be a part of the Kingdom of Hyrule. We want to be our own thing, because Ganondorf is king of the Gerudo. So after that, he's forced to come and swear fealty to the King of Hyrule, which he does in both games. Right? You see him in Ocarina of Time, and that's when young Link and young Zelda are looking through the windows, and you get the iconic do you see the man with the evil eyes scene? And they mirror that scene, but from a different perspective, from the king's perspective, right? Because we don't see the king or anything in Ocarina of Time. Definitely not the same guy, because things have played out differently. The kingdom wasn't established by Zonai, etc. In this timeline, Ganondorf does the exact same thing, comes from the exact same place, but because there's no Triforce, right? So the Triforce is never discovered in this timeline. It's still in the Sacred Realm. Link didn't go on his adventure to obtain it. There is no Triforce. And as far as I know, the Master Sword doesn't exist. It's sealed away wherever it was at the end of Skyward Sword. So the Hyrule doesn't know it. So that explains how Rauru doesn't know what the blade, the legendary blade is, right? He's like, oh, that's neat. So Ganondorf is not interested in obtaining the Triforce because nobody knows about the Triforce. He's interested in the next best thing, which is the Zonai's secret stones. So he obtains it, kills Sonya, and then takes it, becomes the Demon King, and then they all band together, all the sages. They get their powers from these secret stones, and then Rauru seals Ganondorf. So, what needs to happen from here? It's a bunch of stuff. But we have the other timelines. So, in the adult timeline, Ganondorf comes back, right? He breaks through his seal, and then the people and the kingdom, they wish for the hero, right? They want the hero to come back, but he never appears because he left, and he took the Master Sword with him. And there's something about the Master Sword which is intrinsic to the hero, and without it in their timeline, he just doesn't exist. And so then you get the new Link in the Wind Waker, who's just a random kid who just needs to go find his sister because Ganondorf is looking for girls, right? He's looking for young Hylian girls because he's looking for the next incarnation of Zelda. The Master Sword in this game doesn't have the same properties or design of the previous Master Sword, right? It's used as a key to seal time in the Castle of Hyrule. That's not how the Master Sword worked before, so why does it work like that now? And I guess you could say the Master Sword does whatever you need it to do, but there's a lot of evidence to say that it's a completely different Master Sword. Especially, there's a whole line that Ganondorf says, talking about the fools down in the Kingdom of Hyrule who made the sword, which that's not how the Master Sword was made, right? So this is a different Master Sword that they make specifically to trap Ganondorf and his minions inside of the castle, and then they flood Hyrule, right? That was the big plan. Get him in there, trap him, flood it. And I guess we'll come back to that timeline after. Let's jump over to Majora's Mask. So Majora's Mask is a direct continuation from the child line of Ocarina of Time. So young Link comes back and goes, I want to find Navi, my fairy, who left at the end of the last game for reasons. And then they go. He ends up in that parallel dimension of Termina and does the whole adventure. And then he comes back and presumably becomes a knight of Hyrule. Okay. Onto our new timeline. So, the Sage of Time, Zelda, tells everyone about the sages. Like she tells the sages that the hero Link will eventually come when Ganondorf reawakens, and that you all need to be willing to give him his power, or give them their power, which they all agree to in very similar cutscenes. Thanks, repetitive cutscenes. And then it's shortly after that where Zelda's secret stone, like she's wondering like what she needs to do, and the secret stone like glows, and then the Master Sword appears to her, the damaged one from her time. And then she realizes that she needs to go through the process that Minoru told her about, the draconification, and so that she can pour the sacred power that she has innately into the Master Sword to repair it over a really, really, really long time. And so she does that. She becomes the immortal light dragon and is using her power to restore the Master Sword. So she just flies up into the back into Skyland. So important note, Skyland, the cloud barrier is not gone in this timeline. Nothing ever broke it. The islands up there are still hidden, and she goes up there. We can tell this because in Breath of the Wild, you can't see any of the Sky Islands up there. They all appear in Tears of the Kingdom. And the dragons in Breath of the Wild used to do this thing where they would kind of like create a little wormhole in the sky and then like go up through the clouds and disappear. And I think that was the dragons using like their power to go through the cloud barrier, which only exists in this scenario, right? Wouldn't exist in the other scenario. It was dispelled. So she becomes a light dragon. Lots of time passes. I had to really condense things on this timeline because I think that there's like a lot of time that goes by here. But at a certain point, the Hyrule Kingdom has to find the Triforce. So if you look at the designs on like the Triforce is not really mentioned at all in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. The Triforce seems to be a long forgotten thing, but not entirely. It exists on architecture and weapons. It's like a cultural design element that is used by the Hylians. And I think that means that the Triforce did exist at one point on their timeline. So it's safe to say that the royal family had access to it at a certain point. So this is where we can insert the tragedy of Princess Zelda the First. So up to this point, there hasn't been a Princess Zelda. Sage of Time Zelda's not a princess. She's from a different time. She's taking on a completely different role. Zelda from Skyward Sword, not a princess, just a girl. Goddess of Hylia, but not Princess Zelda. So this is where you get the Princess Zelda the First. You know, her brother, the prince, was promised the whole Triforce, as has been done for generations of kings. And the king saw the darkness in him and decided to split off the Triforce of Wisdom and give it to Princess Zelda instead. And then when the prince got the Triforce, he only got the one piece, and he was being manipulated and corrupted by an evil wizard. And he got mad at his sister that she wouldn't tell him where the rest of the Triforce was, and so he had that evil wizard place the eternal sleeping curse on her. And the wizard died from doing that. Okay, sure. And then he was so overcome with his grief that after the wizard was done and gone, that he realized what he had done, and that's when he made it like a rule for the royal family to always call the female daughters like they must be named Zelda, right? That's where that bit of backstory comes from, and this is why it's so weird that on the Hyrule Historia that's like we're like 6 Zeldas in. At least, right? You have, if it's before on the old timeline, it's before the Zelda in A Link to the Past and the yet to be A Link Between Worlds. It's before Ocarina of Time Zelda, or like after. These games are all before it. So you have Link Between Worlds, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Minish Cap. That is 4 Zeldas before Zelda the First. Princess Zeldas. Then you also have the Skyward Sword one, which she doesn't count. See how that's weird? That the rule of naming Zeldas in the royal family only becomes a rule like pretty much at the end. Like there's 2 games after this with one Zelda that matters. So it's a strange thing to put there. It makes a lot more sense being here as the first Zelda, as like a little bit of backstory, and then she's sleeping for eternity. She can just sleep for eternity. So as much time as we want can pass from now until Zelda 2. It's fine. So sometime after this, the Triforce eventually returns to the Sacred Realm, because that seems to be its natural resting place. Like it always ends up there. Whether they put it back intentionally or it just sort of retreats there eventually on its own, it's unknown. Sometime after that, Hyrule starts to feel like without it needs some other power. Which is when the Sheikah start to become really advanced, right? The Sheikah, inspired by the Zonai technology that it has been around since, they came down and started reigning. When you look at Sheikah tech in Breath of the Wild, it has a very similar style to the Zonai, but it's its own distinct thing. But it's if you look at it, you can see how like they must have been inspired by them in the first place. So they get all advanced and they start creating all the guardians and the divine beasts and stuff to protect the kingdom, because they don't have the Triforce anymore. Because it went back to the Sacred Realm. So now we have the Great Calamity happens. So this is Ganondorf's first attempt to resurrect, right? Sort of resurrect. It's more like a byproduct of him just being sealed there. His malice starts to come out and attack things, and the original hero. Okay, so we have I think they call him the ancient hero in game. When you collect all the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom, you get the aspect of the ancient hero, I think it's called, which is an armor set, and it gives Link a new appearance. And I guess he's supposed to be Zonai. It's kind of weird because he doesn't exactly look like any of the other Zonai. He doesn't have nearly as large of ears. That he's got red hair, and he's supposed to be the Link hero that is depicted in the mural in Breath of the Wild. So there's the mural that Zelda is looking at and that the King of Hyrule are looking at, and they're going, this is how they defeated the Great Calamity. They had a hero with the Master Sword. They had a princess with sacred powers, and they had the divine beasts and the guardians, along with the champions to pilot them. And they were successful, right? That we know that original Great Calamity, they were successful, and they sealed Ganondorf away, or Calamity Ganon. Because at this point, Ganondorf is sealed below the castle with Rauru. And then sometime after the Great Calamity, the king started to become afraid, right? So he got afraid of the Sheikah technology because he thought it was way too powerful and that the Sheikah could rise up against him. And so he orders it all to be buried, right? He doesn't have it disassembled or whatever. He has it buried. And then the Sheikah return to a more traditional lifestyle, right? They become the village, agriculture, that kind of thing. They slowly just rein it in. They go from village to smaller until there's almost none of them left. Man, my game keeps turning off. Alright. So, let's go to the next page. And I guess we'll jump back to Wind Waker. So Ganondorf is there. He's looking for the young girls. He accidentally steals Link's sister. Link goes on his adventure and finds that Master Sword. And then he has to go through some trials to be accepted by the gods as the next hero. He has to do that himself. He has to take that. Because he isn't. He's just some kid. But he wills it to be by proving himself. Then they gather the Triforce when in their encounter with Ganondorf. They have their big climactic battle. As the King of Hyrule stepped in and used the Triforce to just wish that Hyrule would just be washed away because there's no saving it, and Ganondorf is, is a relic and he should drown with it. Okay, so back on the child timeline, after Majora's Mask, Link has become a knight, and it's been a really long time. So Ganondorf is, in that timeline, hasn't been able to do his plan. His plan is not... He doesn't get to try to usurp the king or whatever, because I guess Link and Zelda, convince them that he's bad. And he's executed, or they put him up for execution, right? We see that in Twilight Princess. He's supposed to be executed, but then after they stab him, he brings out his Triforce of Power and gets his second wind back, kills one of the sages, and then they seal him in the Twilight Realm, which is where all Twilight Princess happens after that. So he corrupts the Twilight Zant into usurping Midna, the queen, and then the other Link from this time, brand new Link, goes on his adventure and saves it, and eventually they end up fighting Ganondorf. So that's on the next page. So they defeat Zant, And all the while, this Link is learning from the previous Link, right? So we know that the hero's shade, the one that teaches Link all of the sword techniques throughout the game, in the Hyrule Historia, it directly says that that's the spirit of the Link from Ocarina of Time. But, you know, clearly he was a knight, because look at how he's dressed. So, let's jump back over to our new timeline. So, Ganondorf's spirit is in the Sacred Realm. So, this needs explanation. So Rauru seals Ganondorf by, you know, grabbing him with his hand and using his light powers on him, and is able to somehow just seal them both in place. And I think that there's got to be some sort of spiritual element to his power. And that seals Ganondorf's spirit in the Sacred Realm. So his physical form is being held in place by Rauru under the castle, while his spirit has been sealed in the Sacred Realm. And it's been there for a really long time at this point. And that just gives it the opportunity to fester and become a new thing, right? It taints the Sacred Realm into the Dark World, which is what we see in A Link to the Past. And so it manifests as Ganon, the monster Ganon. For some time, the Sacred Realm was rumored, right? Like the Royal Kingdom knew of it, and it must have fallen into some sort of state of being kind of legendary and not really known of anymore. But the Golden Land, like, promise of this, like, golden power. So lots of people and, like, people looking to get that golden power for themselves would venture into the Sacred Realm, and they just would never come back because it was the Dark World. They got turned into monsters. So that leads into the Link to the Past. So you have Link, new Link, is telepathically beckoned, summoned by Zelda. He comes and saves her. There's the evil wizard Aghanim, and he wants to release Ganon from the Sacred Realm so that he can, you know, take over Hyrule. And then Link obtains the Master Sword, which is in the Lost Woods now. So I guess the temple eroded away to the point of just being woods. And that's, you know, where the Master Sword lies in this particular time. Up until then, it just was never pulled, right? But there had been no hero before this, except for, I guess, the ancient hero, right? He had the sword. So maybe he put it in the Lost Woods. Yeah, that makes sense. So, we know that the Link's Awakening comes after A Link to the Past. That is the same Link. So he goes on an adventure to, you know, find new things to explore and training to be had. And he goes on his little adventure. He gets shipwrecked, gets his the instruments and wakes the windfish. And then he has, like, that nightmare of Ganon returning, because, like, he slayed that beast Ganon in the Dark World. And then he has that nightmare of Ganon coming back. And then, you know, the whole thing turns out to be a dream. And Link goes on his adventures. You know, he ends up where he was going, which is Holodrum and Libriana. And then Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons. I'm not going to get into the specifics on that, other than it ends in a plot from the sorceress to resurrect Ganon, but it doesn't work, and he comes back as just like a mindless beast, and then Link defeats him. So Link was able to stop the resurrection attempt because he saw the premonition from Link's Awakening. So I think that's probably the reason why they changed the order of those games on the timeline, because the other way around doesn't work, or isn't as important. Okay. So, we go back over to the Wind Waker timeline. After the Wind Waker, they go on their adventure for Phantom Hourglass, and I mean, Phantom Hourglass is just, it's a cute game, but not a lot happens. They save the Ocean King from a demon, and then they find a new continent at the end. Or that's at the beginning of Spirit Tracks. Either way, it leads to Spirit Tracks, which is like 100 years later or something, and they founded a new Hyrule on a new kingdom, or a new land, new continent. And then there's the Demon King trapped in a tower there, and whether or not that's another, like, incarnation of Demise is up for however you want to feel about it. But yeah, Link defeats Malladus, and then, yay, kingdom is saved. So back over on the Twilight Princess, Ganondorf dies here, right? Link fights Ganondorf at the end of the game and defeats him, but it isn't a sealing, and it isn't a banishing, or like in the Wind Waker he gets turned to stone, which isn't death, it's just he's trapped there, right? In Twilight Princess, he gets stabbed, tries to use the Triforce of Power to, like, get a second wind again, and then he sees the spirit of Zant, who he, like, betrayed, right? Like, earlier in the game, he kind of betrayed him and didn't fulfill his end of the deal to him, and so Zant just kind of does this creepy, like, head snap thing, and then Ganondorf dies on the spot. And that is, like, up until this point, this is the only actual point in which Ganondorf dies. All other times he's sealed away or something, just to prevent him from doing stuff. So a little bit later, you get the follow-up to Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures. And, like, Vaati reappears, because whatever, Four Sword, he was trapped in the Four Sword. And then, like, there's another Ganondorf. And this Ganondorf seems to be completely different. And it says so in the Hyrule Historia that it's a new Ganondorf. And he's a reincarnation, right? So we know that Link and Zelda reincarnate all the time. Lots of characters reincarnate, actually, when you think about it. Beetle reincarnates all the time, and so there seems to be a cycle for all the people in Hyrule, and they die and then are reborn as essentially the same person, except for Ganondorf, right? Because Ganondorf is always sealed away or otherwise incapacitated, but he's always the same dude until he actually dies in Twilight Princess. Then he is reborn as a new Ganondorf, and he's still the incarnation of Demise, right? Like, he's just the same in that respect. And then they seal him away. I mean, what are you gonna do to Ganondorf? You can't keep him down. But he gets sealed away as he transforms into a new Dark Beast Ganon, and then they seal him in the Four Sword, and then they place a barrier over the sword. Okay, so I'm gonna just point this out because this will become relevant later. So, I have this bit called Sealed Throughout Time. And I'm just going to read exactly what I wrote here. So, to ensure that Ganondorf the First could not come back again, because he reincarnated that one time and then they dealt with him, and he sealed forever in the Four Sword. The Ganondorf the Second. Ganondorf the First, presumably, could come back again. So the sages take his spirit and seal it through 4 different eras of time. They disperse him throughout time so that he can't be reassembled. More on that later. So, let's go back to Oracle of Ages and Seasons. That plays out. He defeats Ganon. So, like 100 years later or something, I think that it's always 100 years-ish, a Link Between Worlds happens. It's a new Link. He goes on his adventure with the traveling between Hyrule and Lorule, and it's like a parallel universe that's like a dark version. Or it was a perfect parallel, but then they decided to destroy their Triforce, and then they became like a dark world, and they then wanted to steal Hyrule's Triforce to restore their land. And anyways, in the end, Link and Zelda have to defeat another resurrection of Ganon because Yuga, the bad guy, resurrects him to get the Triforce of Power. And then they beat him and they seal him away. Or no, they don't seal him away, they just defeat him. But that's because Ganon can be defeated. But he always comes back, so yeah, they use the Triforce to restore the Triforce in Lorule so that Lorule can come back and be saved. So, and then that same Link goes on to do Triforce adventures. His hair suddenly becomes green, and I'm not going to talk about the game because I haven't played it. And all I know is that it's very fashionable, and Link gets lots of outfits. And meets with a red and blue Link, who are just other dudes. They put it on the timeline. They're the ones that are saying it's canon, not me. But also, if that game's allowed to be canon, so is Cadence of Hyrule. That's all I'm saying. Cadence of Hyrule is a good game. Okay. So this is why the sealing of that first Spirit of Ganondorf is so important, because we're trying to fit all the games on the timeline here. So Hyrule Warriors, its story was surprisingly considerate of the lore established by Skyward Sword and the previous timeline in Hyrule Historia. It came out post Historia, so it was very respectful of the timeline and a lot of the ideas present in the lore. And under this circumstance that they have taken the first Ganondorf spirit and sealed it throughout time, you can then have Hyrule Warriors, because that's its backstory, right? Sia and Lana together were the goddess of time. They had been watching Link jealously throughout the eras. And Ganondorf's spirit, after being sent through time, is like corrupting her, and she decides to, take action, listen to him, try to resurrect him so that she can, or he can help her get Link. Right? Like, that was her whole motivation. And in doing so, she opens up a whole bunch of portals, which connects various eras of time throughout Hyrule history together for an extended period of time where they're all having their big war, right? Eventually she resurrects Ganondorf, and he's seemingly the original Ganondorf and not Ganondorf the Second. And then they are able to seal him again at the end of the game. But that is a lot of crossover here. So basically every game from every timeline here is represented in some way in this game. And, like, after the main story, like, a portal to the Wind Waker timeline, like, opens up, and then they have, like, another little thing with them, and so, and then, like, Marin and Yuga and all these characters, they all, you know, come into it. So there's a large thing here that's happening, and that's the convergence of the timeline, briefly. And it's really enough time for, you know, relics and stories of these other adventures from different sages and other games to get passed around to all of the different ends of time. So this is important just as like a tiny little like thing to fill in some of the fan servicey bits of Breath of the Wild, right? So if you cure some fan service with more fan service. Okay, so back to our other timeline. Let's see where we were. So Triforce Heroes leads to the Legend of Zelda. So the Triforce of Wisdom is separated by Zelda. She needs a hero to go and defeat Ganon because Ganon has appeared and he's got his monsters, and then Link gets the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and then goes and beats Ganon. Like, Ganon is never more than like a monster jumping around in a room. So we can presume that he's, at this point, Ganon the Beast has devolved into just a mindless creature. And then later, with the same Link, he's older, and he starts to have that, the Triforce appears on his hand. So he goes to Impa, and Impa and him stumble upon the chamber that has the first Zelda the First, her like sleeping room or whatever, where she's entombed to sleep for all eternity. And yeah, Link goes on an adventure to find the Triforce of Courage because it's calling out to him, and he succeeds in fighting off Shadow Link and then uses the Triforce to awaken Princess Zelda. That's the story of the game. But in doing so, he prevents the resurrection of Ganon. So Ganon fails to resurrect again. This is important. So now we've moved on to Breath of the Wild, right? So in a distant amount of time. So we know that Breath of the Wild takes place 10,000 years after the Great Calamity. Or the Calamity takes place 10,000 years after the Great Calamity. Breath of the Wild takes place 100 years after that. Because, you know, Breath of the Wild. Okay, so the Calamity returns. They plan for it. They have, you know, documents of the Calamity. They know what it's supposed to look like, in that it's the buildup of malice, and then it's going to erupt into a ethereal creature, and they're going to have to handle it. Zelda specifically describes that, like, after a period of time, Ganon gave up on resurrection, and he gave up on resurrection because he failed to resurrect, and so he goes back to Plan A, right? If Plan A was the Calamity, and this is just like his spirit, his essence, right? It's not really like a thoughtful thing on Ganondorf's part. It's just like the will of demise bleeding out into the world. If Plan A was the Calamity, and the Calamity failed, so he switches to Plan B, which is to manifest in another realm as a monster and then keep resurrecting, and then he fails, so he goes back to plan A. So the calamity comes back 10,000 years later. And they fail this time. But not before a little robot, right? They unearthed all the ancient Sheikah tech, which is ancient, right? They describe it as ancient, and it would be at this point, right? So they have all the ancient Sheikah tech. Zelda has like a little one that she had as a child, and then it's just sitting on a shelf or whatever, and it goes, calamity's happening. I'm gonna go and open up a time portal, and then boop, boop, it ends up in the past. And so they all fail at dealing with Calamity Ganon. Link's injured. Zelda has to put him in the Shrine of Resurrection, and then she puts the Master Sword with the Deku Tree, and then she goes to seal Ganon for as long as she can, which is like 100 years to give Link enough time. That little guardian, Terrako, goes back and gives them the foresight to be able to succeed. So you get a split timeline there where Terrako goes, they succeed, and they do some time travel shenanigans, and they're able to defeat the Calamity Ganon. So joke's on them. I guess Ganondorf's going to come after them soon. Maybe we'll see that in a future game. But so Link wakes up 100 years later, goes on his Breath of the Wild adventure, and defeats the Calamity Ganon. And then Zelda and Link begin to rebuild Hyrule. And at some point, they decide to dismantle all the Sheikah tech, right? Because we don't see it in Tears of the Kingdom. There's no Sheikah tech left for the most part. There's a little bit of it, and it seems to have been salvaged and repurposed. Purah and the researchers, like the science teams at Lookout Landing, seem to have it, and they've used a bunch of guardians and stuff to make their towers, and the Purah pad seems to be Sheikah tech, some sort of enhanced version of the Sheikah Slate from Breath of the Wild. Now in the shape of a Switch and not a Wii U. Yeah, so they scrap it all. At the end of Breath of the Wild, right, they get reports that Vah-Ruta, one of the divine beasts the Zoras have, stopped working. So I think that's supposed to be a hint that it's all really old, and they kind of used it all, and most of it broke, and it all was turned against them. So they just decided, like, hey, I guess we're better off without this, and we'll just take what we can, but let's dismantle the dangerous stuff, and the shrines for some reason, and the towers. All of it. I mean, we don't see them, so they're gone. They clearly repurposed them. Okay, so then it comes to Tears of the Kingdom. So the gloom of Ganondorf starts to build up under the castle because he's just, I don't know, they defeated the Calamity and he's coming back, I guess. It's unclear why. And then all the events happen, right? So the arm has the secret stone, Zelda gets it, the Master Sword gets decayed, Ganondorf, uses his gloom power to, like, raise the castle, and the act of doing that seems to dispel the cloud barrier, and all the Sky Islands come down. And the dragon, that is Sage of Time Zelda, who, during the beginning of the game, right, she blips out of existence after falling into that chasm. She ends up in the distant past to eventually make her way back to the present, but she's never seen ever in that entire time, even in Breath of the Wild, right? because she's above the clouds. She's flying around in Skyland beyond the barrier. Yeah, so they get all that together. Link's arm is ruined, right? Rauru gives him his arm, and then he has Zonai powers. The game happens, right? The main Link story. And I haven't finished it yet, so there's a possibility that there's something that happens at the end of this game that completely throws the whole idea out the window, but probably not, right? I mean, my guess is Link wins and that Zelda is somehow transformed back into her normal form somehow, right? Like, that's Zelda games are they're mostly predictable from their start to finish point. It's like the weird in-between lore and stuff that raises the biggest questions. And I think that's the backstory lore in Tears of the Kingdom. It greatly contradicts the existing timeline to such a degree that it has to exist on its own timeline. So the way that this one's laid out, we fix the hero is defeated timeline, right? That was terrible. So now it gets to exist within that 10,000 year period of time, because 10,000 years is a long time. It's a really long time. The entirety of human civilization is only about 12,000 years. So it's a long time, really long. Like, there are 3 links that go on an adventure in that time, right? You have the Link to the Past Link, the Link Between Worlds Link, and the Legend of Zelda Link. And they go on some adventures, and they're still like teenagers, right? So what are we talking here? We're talking 3 links over the course of probably about 300-ish years between them all. That's nothing. That's literally nothing, right? That in 10,000 years, that's a blink. Nobody would really even remember these things happening other than a couple of stories about, like, hey, yeah, Ganon is a problem that keeps resurfacing. And he probably resurfaced a lot more than this, right? In the future, we're probably going to see more games that bring back Ganon, because they love to bring back the pig beast Ganon. And this is where he is primarily, right? Other than Four Swords Adventures, which is a different Ganon. And then, of course, this timeline also solves the Princess Zelda the First issue. This way she is actually the first Zelda, if you place that tragedy happening earlier than the Great Calamity, because you need a Princess Zelda in the Great Calamity to help the ancient hero fight Calamity Ganon. How he is a Zonai is unclear, right? Or is he a Zonai? Like, he doesn't look like Rauru. He doesn't look like Minoru. He looks like completely different. Is he a Hylian Zonai hybrid? Probably. But, okay. Maybe we'll learn more about that in the future. But it's just an interesting little bit that they threw into the game, so it's worth looking at. Yeah, I think the biggest points of this timeline revision is that Skyland needs to continue to exist, and Skyland does not exist after Skyward Sword's main ending, right, with Link and Zelda, because it's gone, it's fallen, it's come back to the surface. The Sky Islands in Tears of the Kingdom Like, that shouldn't be up there unless Skyland is still up there. And the only way that it can still be up there is if it's after Skyward Sword, but the other timeline where Demise doesn't really exist or isn't a threat, and therefore they don't have to use the Triforce to bring it down. Let's just come back up here. So it is interesting, right? If we look at the parallels between Ocarina of Time and the events that are happening in the Tears of the Kingdom backstory stuff, it's so similar, right? There's a lot of scenes with Ganondorf that harken back to events that supposedly happened and ones that we directly see, right? The man with the evil eyes. So yeah, Link defeats the Demon King, and then it splits. And then the Imprisoning War, right? They use the word the Imprisoning War, so it makes sense to try to link it to the Imprisoning War that's already on the timeline. So I think that this timeline fixes a lot of the issues present on the old timeline. I also saw a really interesting theory that was very similar to mine, but it also moved the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures into the timeline too, and put it before A Link to the Past. And while I really liked the theory because they linked the Picori to the Zonai and said like the Zonai left and became the Picori, and I think it's a really interesting idea, but it doesn't mesh with the idea of a Ganondorf II, right? So because Ganondorf never dies in this timeline, he's sealed by Rauru. He can't be reincarnated. If he were to be reincarnated, it would be extremely weird, because then you would have two Ganondorfs that exist at the exact same time. Though, multiple Zeldas exist at the same time, so always a possibility, I guess. The more you think about these things, the weirder it gets. So, I mean, it's also completely possible that, you know, the timeline as it is exactly the same. The Skyward Sword split happens, and it just leads to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and there's nothing else in between, right? That is completely plausible and acceptable. I just think it's a fun idea to try to fix the heroes defeated timeline, because it's not ideal. But anyways, I'm gonna stop going on about this, because I think I've more or less gone through it all and explained my ideas. And I'm tired from talking constantly for like an hour straight. So I'm gonna head out. And I think next time that I'm back, I will probably be doing some art. I guess. We'll see. Come and hang out, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.